Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep today into a recent prisoner exchange. It's between Israel and Hamas.
Oh, this is a fascinating one.
Yeah, and we've got articles and even some YouTube videos. I think what's going to be really interesting here is this exchange. Like, it's not just a straightforward event.
Right.
There's a real human element to it. The messaging behind it is really interesting. And there are some really unexpected moments we're going to look at that have sparked quite a bit of discussion.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is so interesting about this is that it's not even just a one-off thing. It's just the first part of a much bigger agreement.
Oh, wow.
Which I think adds a whole other layer to how we look at this.
So in this initial phase, we saw 2 Israeli hostages released in Rafah,
Right.
which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a key border crossing point between Gaza and Egypt.
Right.
And then 3 Israeli detainees were released in the Nuseirat refugee camp. Hamas also announced the release of a 6th Israeli prisoner, but like with zero ceremony. I mean, what struck me just looking at this is the sheer scale of this potential agreement.
It's really remarkable. I mean, we're looking at the possible return of like 22 to 25 living prisoners and at least 35 deceased prisoners, all held by Hamas.
Wow.
I mean, can you imagine just the logistics of this, the lives hanging in the balance,
Right.
the families just waiting and waiting for news? It's
Yeah, it's almost impossible to fathom. And I mean, beyond those challenges, what really stands out to me is how Hamas used this exchange to, I don't know, almost like send these very deliberate messages
Oh, absolutely.
to both Israel and the international community, you know?
Yeah, it's like a carefully orchestrated kind of performance. I mean, take, for example, just the location of that first release, right, in Rafah, right next to Israeli tanks.
Right.
I mean, that imagery, just speaks for its own. It's about defiance.
And then on top of that, they've got the signage. It says Hamas is the next day, right there at the exchange. And I mean, it's such a bold statement. You know what they're trying to say.
Right, right.
It leaves no room for doubt.
There's no question what they're saying there.
About what their intentions are, about, remaining a force to be reckoned with. I mean, you've got to imagine these messages. They must have had a huge impact on the Israeli public.
Absolutely. Especially, I mean, when you think about, how sensitive the whole issue of prisoners is in Israel. I mean, over 70% of Israelis, they support the return of all of their prisoners.
Wow.
Both living and dead, from Gaza. So you can just imagine how closely they're going to be scrutinizing every single detail of this exchange.
Absolutely. And speaking of details that are like sparking debate, there's one moment from this exchange that's really just captivated everyone's attention. So an Israeli soldier gets released after 15 months in Hamas captivity.
Right.
And he kisses the heads of 2 Hamas militants.
It's really generated a lot of conversation. And, I think particularly because it goes against kind of the way we typically think of Hamas.
Right.
As it's portrayed in, say, the Israeli media. It makes us really re-examine our assumptions.
It really does. I was struck by how, this one single act, it was caught on video.
Right.
And it's prompted such a range of reaction, particularly within the Israeli media. Like, it's all over the place.
Well, and it is a perfect example, I think, of how the same event can be totally framed and interpreted in completely different ways. I mean, you had some Israeli outlets describing this kiss as psychological terrorism, questioning the soldier's state of mind.
Right.
Really painting, I don't know, a kind of ominous picture.
But on the other hand, you have other outlets, and they're focusing on, like, how he was smiling and appeared to be in good health.
Right.
They contrasted that with, like, how serious the Hamas fighters were. And,
right.
and I mean, it just really highlights the power of narrative and how that can, shape public perception.
Yeah, it's really powerful how that can play out.
But even with all that going on, there's another story here that I think we can't overlook. The families of the 2 remaining Israeli hostages, they're demanding the release of a video showing their loved ones.
Yeah, I mean, that's a powerful move. It's a direct challenge to the Israeli security establishment.
Right.
And it kind of inflects this growing feeling among the Israeli public. I think people are tired.
Yeah. They're
tired of the conflict. They want answers, and they're starting to really, really question the official narrative that they're being given.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, this kind of ties into a larger trend. It seems like Israeli public opinion is shifting. There's more and more pressure on the government to really pursue a peaceful resolution, like finally end this conflict.
You're seeing a real disconnect between kind of the official government stance
right.
and what people on the ground actually feel. The polls show that a majority of Israelis, they support negotiations and a lasting peace agreement, even if it means concessions.
Wow. And this is all happening while President Trump just recently said he wouldn't impose his Gaza plan, which some have taken to mean like he's rejecting the idea of Palestinian displacement.
Right.
And then you've got all these Arab efforts going on to de-escalate. Like
Right.
it's a really dynamic situation right now. I mean, it really makes you wonder like what's next? What happens to Gaza? Will Hamas stay in control?
Right.
Can they even reach a lasting peace agreement at this point? Like, there's just so much to think about.
I think it's a situation where, you have all these different political maneuvers, you have public pressure, and then you have these deeply personal stories.
Right.
And it all comes together. And it really, I think, underscores how fragile any peace process is in that region.
Yeah.
It's a really delicate situation.
It really is.
Very complex.
It is. And, it's easy to get, caught up in the political side of things.
Right.
But I keep thinking about, those personal stories, particularly that soldier who kissed the Hamas militants.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a video online, and it shows him doing something even more unexpected during the exchange.
Oh, are you talking about the video on Osama Gawesh's YouTube channel?
Yeah.
The one where Omar Shimtov, the soldier, is standing on the platform. He looks so happy, so at ease.
Exactly, and he's smiling, he's waving his release papers, and then he just leans over and kisses the heads of these two Hamas fighters that are standing next to him. I mean, it's a gesture that a lot of people, they just can't reconcile that with how they view Hamas,
Right.
As this militant organization.
It's such a sharp contrast. It makes you question, what would make someone do that? Like, what does that say about the effects of captivity on a person? Like their empathy, the crazy complexities of a situation like that.
It definitely sparked some strong reactions. Even the Al Jazeera Arabic channel, they were talking about how shocked the Israeli media were, especially the ones from the Khan channel.
Well, yeah, there's this real sense of disbelief, like they're trying to make sense of it.
Right.
Because it just seems to defy all logic and expectations. I mean, some are even calling it psychological terrorism, right? Saying that it was all planned out by Hamas, that they were manipulating him, to demoralize Israel.
That's a pretty harsh take.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you contrast it with the people who are saying, oh, this is evidence of Gaza syndrome. This idea that captives, they actually develop positive feelings towards their captors as a coping mechanism.
Right.
And there was even a psychologist on Al Hadaf, and he was comparing it to Stockholm syndrome. He was saying that, maybe Gaza syndrome is actually a better term for this whole phenomenon.
It is. It makes you think about, the long-term psychological impacts of being a captive, right? And I think it also just highlights how complex the relationship can get between a captor and a captive, especially in such a long and intense situation.
Yeah, and this isn't just something that the media and psychologists are talking about. The families of the two remaining Israeli hostages, they want answers too. They're calling for the release of a video of their loved ones.
Right.
Which is, I mean, it's a pretty bold move.
It is, yeah.
And it really says a lot.
Yeah, it kind of points to a growing distrust of the Israeli government and how they've handled this whole thing.
Right.
It's not just blindly accepting what they're being told anymore.
Right.
They want to see it for themselves. They want accountability.
Absolutely. And their actions, they're kind of part of this bigger trend we're seeing. Public opinion in Israel is changing. There's more pressure on the government to really try to find a peaceful end to all of those.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing a real shift.
It's fascinating. You've got this prisoner exchange that's brought to light, all this political maneuvering, public pressure, and then, all these human stories that sometimes get lost in the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And those stories, they challenge the narratives that we're used to hearing, right? I mean, the soldier kissing his captors, the families demanding videos. These moments force us to remember that this isn't just a political game. It's deeply personal.
Right.
It's people's lives.
Absolutely. And speaking of challenging narratives, there's this other detail from the exchange that really stuck with me. Hamas, they made it a point to release an Israeli prisoner of Ethiopian descent, but they did it without any ceremony.
That's interesting. It's a very deliberate choice on their part.
Right.
I think it speaks to a couple of things. I mean, first of all, it shows how diverse Israeli society really is, right? This conflict, it affects everyone.
Right.
Doesn't matter what your background is. But then second of all, I think, you could also see it as a strategic move on Hamas's part. Maybe they're trying to appeal to marginalized groups within Israel.
Right.
Maybe even trying to sow some discord.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in a situation as complex as this, there's always more than one perspective, and those perspectives, they're always changing as new things happen.
Right, it's always evolving.
And it's fascinating to see how all of this is being portrayed in the media, too. I mean, for instance, Al Mayadeen, they were really focused on the imagery of the whole exchange. You know, they were showing the Palestinian flag, the clenched fists, the slogans about liberation. And that's a really stark contrast to what we saw from some Israeli media who, like we said, they zeroed in on that soldier's kiss. Like that was their main focus. They saw it as a sign of weakness or manipulation.
It's such a great example of how powerful visuals and symbols can be, right? The same exact event can be shown in totally different ways depending on like the political and cultural lens it's being viewed through.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, we have those families of the remaining hostages who are demanding that video.
Right.
Al Jazeera even covered that story. It's a bold move that's gotten a lot of public support, and it really puts the pressure on the Israeli government to find some kind of solution.
Yeah, it's really powerful. It reminds us that this conflict isn't just some abstract thing playing out in the political sphere.
Right.
It's real people, real families dealing with the consequences of this struggle. And they're the ones who are suffering.
So where do we go from here? What's next for Gaza? What about peace negotiations? Like, is there any hope?
I honestly, I don't think anybody knows for sure. Crazy that Trump's not imposing his plan. That throws a real wrench in things.
Right.
And the Arab world is really stepping up trying to de-escalate.
Right.
So it's this balance, between diplomacy and the real threat that things could get violent again.
Yeah, yeah.
It's hard to say if Hamas will lose their grip on Gaza or if a lasting peace agreement is even possible at this point. I mean, I think only time will tell.
It will.
But what we do know for sure is that this prisoner exchange, it's just one piece of a much bigger and more complicated story.
Right.
It's a story of heartbreak, of hope, of defiance, of desperation, and this constant search for some kind of peace.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's a story that deserves our attention, it deserves our empathy, and it deserves our willingness to really think about the difficult questions that it raises.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm left with a final thought-provoking question for everyone listening. If you were in that soldier's shoes, if you had gone through 15 months of captivity, how do you think you would have reacted? What does that say about us as humans? About our resilience, about forgiveness, about the power of hope, even when faced with such incredible adversity?
It's a good question to think about.
It really is. It really is a complex situation with so many layers, and it's easy to get caught up in the political side of things, but I keep coming back to the personal stories, especially that of the Israeli soldier who kissed the Hamas militants. There's actually a video circulating online that shows him doing something even more unexpected during the exchange.
You're referring to the video from Osama Gawesh's YouTube channel, right?
Yeah.
It shows Omar Shimtov, the soldier, standing on the platform during the exchange, and he just seems happy, at ease.
Exactly. He's smiling, he's waving those release papers, and then he just leans over and kisses the heads of two Hamas fighters standing next to him. I mean, it's a gesture that many find hard to reconcile with this perception of Hamas as, this militant organization.
It's definitely a jarring juxtaposition, right? Like, it really challenges our preconceived notions. I mean, why would he do that? What does this tell us about, the psychology of being held captive, the human capacity for empathy, and the complexities of these extreme situations?
It sparked a lot of strong reactions. Even the Al Jazeera Arabic channel talked about how shocked the Israeli media were by that gesture, especially the ones from the Khan channel.
There's this sense of disbelief, like they're struggling to make sense of an act that seems to go against logic and expectations. I mean, some have even gone so far as to call it psychological terrorism, suggesting that it was a calculated move by Hamas, to manipulate the soldier and undermine morale in Israel.
Which is such a stark contrast to those who see it as evidence of Gaza syndrome, this idea that captives develop positive feelings towards their captors to cope.
Right.
And there was a psychologist on Al-Hadaf who even compared it to Stockholm syndrome, suggesting that Gaza syndrome might be a more fitting term.
Interesting. It's an interesting theory. And it does raise these important questions about the lasting psychological impact of captivity. What's fascinating is that it really underscores this complex relationship that can form between a captor and a captive, especially over a prolonged period in an intense situation like that.
And it's not just the media and psychologists who are thinking about this. The families of the two remaining Israeli hostages, they're also demanding answers. They're calling for the release of a video showing their loved ones, which is a pretty bold move. It speaks volumes.
It does. It suggests that there's this growing distrust of the Israeli government and how they've been handling this whole hostage situation. They're not content with just accepting the official narrative. They want transparency and accountability.
And their actions, they seem to be part of this larger trend that we're seeing in Israel where public opinion is shifting. There's this growing pressure on the government to pursue a peaceful resolution.
Yeah, we're seeing this disconnect between the government's stance and what the people actually want. Polls show that a majority of Israelis, they actually support negotiations and a lasting peace agreement, even if it means making some concessions.
It's a compelling dynamic, right? And I think it's likely going to have a big impact on the future of the region. This prisoner exchange, it's brought to light this interplay of political maneuvering, public pressure, and these incredibly human stories that are often overshadowed by the larger conflict.
It reminds us that peace isn't just about signing agreements on paper, you know. It requires this fundamental change in hearts and minds, a willingness to build trust and a commitment to finding common ground, even when faced with these seemingly impossible differences.
And those differences are definitely apparent when you look at the messages being sent by both sides during this exchange. It's like Hamas is trying to project this image of strength and defiance, but they're also trying to highlight their supposedly humane treatment of the prisoners.
But at the same time, they're still holding those 2 Israeli hostages, which really muddies the water.
Right.
It makes you question their true intentions. It creates this paradox that's really hard to unravel.
And on the Israeli side, you have the government under immense pressure to secure the release of all their citizens, but they're also dealing in internal divisions and this growing public desire for a more peaceful approach.
It's a delicate balancing act with incredibly high stakes. The outcome of this prisoner exchange and any future negotiations could have a profound and lasting impact on the entire region.
You're right, the stakes are so high, and it's easy to get lost in all the political stuff, but I keep coming back to the human cost. You know, families, torn apart lives, lost, a profound sense of pain and suffering, and it's happening on both sides.
Absolutely. And it's those personal stories, the ones that really challenge the narratives we think we know, like the soldier kissing his captors, the families demanding videos. Those moments cut through everything else and make us remember that this conflict isn't just some political chess game. It's deeply personal.
It is, and speaking of challenging narratives, there's another detail from this exchange that really struck me. Hamas made a point of releasing an Israeli prisoner of Ethiopian descent, but they did it without any fanfare.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a deliberate choice for sure. And I think it points to a couple of things. First, it highlights the diversity within Israel itself. This conflict impacts people from all walks of life. And second, I think you could see it as a strategic move by Hamas. Maybe they're trying to appeal to certain groups within Israel, maybe even create some division.
It's a good reminder that even in a conflict as messy as this, there are so many perspectives at play. And those perspectives, they're always in motion. They change as things unfold.
Right, exactly. It's constantly evolving.
And it's fascinating to see how this is all being portrayed in the media, too. Like Al Mayadeen, for instance, they really focused on the imagery of the exchange. The Palestinian flag, the clenched fists, the slogans about liberation. It's such a contrast to some of the Israeli media coverage, which, like we talked about, focused on that soldier's kiss almost exclusively. They presented it as a sign of weakness or manipulation.
It really shows you the power of images and symbols. How they shape our understanding of events. The same event can be presented in completely different ways, just by changing the lens you're looking through, the political lens, the cultural lens, all of that.
It's true. And then you have those families of the remaining hostages who are demanding the release of that video, a story that Al Jazeera also covered. It's such a bold move, and it's gained so much public support, and it puts even more pressure on the Israeli government to find a resolution.
It does. And their plea, it's a powerful reminder. This isn't just a political drama playing out on some distant stage. It's real people's life. It's families grappling with the very real and personal cost of this conflict, this struggle that just keeps going.
So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for Gaza, for peace negotiations? Is there any hope for a resolution?
Honestly, it's hard to say for sure. Right now, the future is uncertain. President Trump deciding not to impose his peace plan. That adds a whole new layer of complexity. And now the Arab world is stepping up their efforts to de-escalate the situation. It's like we're watching this delicate dance between diplomacy and the very real possibility of renewed violence.
It really does feel that way.
Yeah. We can't say for certain if Hamas will lose their control of Gaza or if a lasting peace agreement is even achievable. These are questions that only time can answer.
Right.
But what we do know is that this prisoner exchange, it's just one chapter in a much bigger story. A story filled with so much heartbreak and so much hope, defiance, desperation, and this constant search for a way forward, a way towards peace.
And it's a story that needs our attention, it needs our empathy, and it needs us to wrestle with those difficult questions that it brings up. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave you with one final thought to consider. What if you were that soldier after 15 months in captivity? How would you have reacted? What does your answer say about human nature, about our ability to forgive, about the power of hope, even in the face of incredible hardship? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.